The night Harlow showed up at her door, Wren had $3.40 in her coat pocket, a broken radiator, and a needle she'd been using to stitch the hem of her only good skirt back together. She wasn't expecting anyone. She was never expecting anyone. The knock came at 11:14. She knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock on the microwave, the one that hadn't worked in 6 months, which meant she'd been watching a lie and had just realized it. She'd been eating cold soup straight from the can, standing over the kitchen sink because the table was covered in account ledgers she'd brought home from the office. 16-hour days had a way of bleeding into the furniture. The knock came again. Harder this time. Wren set the can down and pulled her cardigan tighter. She lived on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like cigarettes and old carpet, in a part of the city where knocks at that hour meant one of two things: someone who had the wrong door, or someone who very much had the right one. She looked through the peephole. Her stomach dropped. She'd seen Harlow twice. Once at the quarterly review where she'd presented the discrepancy report, the one that had taken her 3 weeks of unpaid overtime to compile, and once in the elevator when he'd looked straight through her, the way men like him looked through women like her, the way sunlight passes through glass without warming it. He stood in her hallway now in a suit that cost more than her yearly salary, no tie, top button undone. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like that didn't matter to him. She opened the door, not because she wasn't afraid. She was. But Wren had learned a long time ago that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford to perform. "Mr. Harlow," she said. He looked at her. Just looked. The way you look at a ledger when a number doesn't add up and you're trying to decide if it's a typo or a confession. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked down. The needle was still in her right hand. She'd pricked her thumb without noticing. A thin line of red had traced its way down to her wrist. "I'm sewing," she said. "I can see that." Neither of them moved. He was bigger than she remembered, or maybe the hallway was smaller. She'd never had to stand this close to him before. There had always been a conference table between them, or a podium, or the specific kind of social distance that exists between a man who owns the room and a woman who was hired to organize it. "Can I come in?" he asked. It wasn't really a question. She'd learned to hear the difference. She stepped aside. He walked in and stopped in the middle of her living room, taking it in the way a cartographer takes in new territory, not with contempt exactly, but with the careful attention of someone cataloging terrain. The ledgers on the table, the single lamp with the tilted shade, the window that wouldn't close all the way, the gap stuffed with a folded piece of cardboard, the soup can on the counter. "You walked here," she said. "From where?" "I drove." "Why?" He turned to look at her then, and something shifted in his face, not softened. Harlow didn't soften. But there was a weight in his expression that hadn't been there the 2 times she'd seen him before, or maybe it had always been there, and she'd been too busy surviving to notice. "There's a problem," he said. "There's always a problem. That's why you have me. Not this kind." Wren set the needle down on the counter. She folded her arms not because she was cold, but because it was the closest thing she had to armor in a cardigan. "What kind, then?" He pulled a folder from inside his jacket. She hadn't noticed it until now. He held it out to her. She took it. It was her work, her numbers, the discrepancy report from 6 weeks ago, the one she'd submitted and then heard nothing about. Not a word, not even a receipt confirmation from his assistant, which she'd interpreted as the polite corporate equivalent of being ignored. She'd assumed they'd buried it. She'd assumed they'd decided the numbers weren't a problem they wanted to solve. Someone had written in the margins, in red pen, "Check her access logs." She closed the folder. Her hands were very still. She'd learned that too, keeping her hands still when everything else was screaming. "Where did you get this?" she said. "It was on my desk tonight." He hadn't sat down. He was still standing in the middle of her living room, like he wasn't sure the floor could hold him. "Someone left it there, along with a note that said if I wanted to find the real discrepancy, I should start with the person who reported it." The cold from the window gap moved through the room slowly, like it had nowhere better to be. "And you came here," she said, "at 11 o'clock at night. 11:14. She almost laughed. She didn't. To do what, she said. Ward me, or confirm it? He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped, went off and then stopped, like it couldn't decide if anything was worth the effort. I don't know yet, he said. That was honest. She hadn't expected that. She'd spent 6 weeks working for Harlow's organization as an independent contractor, specifically for the subsidiary that handled logistics and supply chain, the one that had a reputation for being profitable, and a reality, she'd discovered, that was somewhat more complicated than that. She had been hired to audit the books. She had done exactly that. And what she'd found had not been a small rounding error or a misfiled expense report. What she'd found was a systematic, careful, beautiful piece of financial misdirection that someone had been running for at least 3 years. She had reported it. Now someone was pointing at her. She understood how this worked. She'd seen it before, in a different city. With a different name on the door, you find the dirt, and then the dirt finds you back. Sit down, she said. He looked at the couch. The cushion on the left had a spring that poked through if you sat too far to the center. She didn't warn him about it. He sat, missed the spring by an inch. She pulled the single chair from the corner and sat across from him, the folder on her knee. I didn't steal anything, she said. I don't need to. I've seen enough people lose everything stealing from men like you that I have no interest in the experiment. Men like me, he repeated. Men who keep score, she said. Men who remember. He studied her. That report took you 3 weeks, 22 days. You did it on your own time. You weren't paying me for that time, no. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt. More like the recognition of a fact he hadn't previously categorized correctly. Why? He said. The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected, but because of how he asked it. No accusation in it, no strategic angle she could detect, just the question. Sitting there in her drafty living room, waiting. She looked at the folder. Because the numbers were wrong, she said, and I don't like wrong numbers. It's a personal failing. Silence. Who has access to your office? She said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She noticed the scar on his left hand then, a long pale ridge running from the base of his thumb to the edge of his wrist. Old. Whatever made it had been serious. My assistant. 3 senior staff. 2 people in security. And who knew about the report before tonight? He didn't answer immediately. Harlow. 4 people, he said, myself included. She let that sit. Then you already know it wasn't me, she said, because I'm not on that list. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't in the elevator, the way he probably didn't look at most people in most rooms. And she held it. She was good at holding things. You're not afraid of me, he said. I'm very afraid of you, she said. I'm just better at being afraid than you are at noticing it. That got something. Not a smile. She didn't think Harlow's face remembered how to do that anymore. But the corner of his mouth moved, the way a locked door moves when you push it hard enough to feel the mechanism inside. I need to know who has it out for you, he said. And why? I need to eat something, she said. And then we can talk about who has it out for me. The list is longer than you'd probably expect. She got up and went to the kitchen. The soup can was still on the counter. She opened the cabinet above it and found a sleeve of crackers and a jar of peanut butter that was 3/4 empty. She put them on the counter, thought about it, and then opened the refrigerator. There was half a block of cheddar, some mustard, and an apple. She put the apple back. I can get someone to bring food, Harlow said from the living room. At 11:15 in this neighborhood, she said. The only thing someone's going to bring is trouble. Crackers are fine. She heard him shift on the couch. She heard the spring. There it is, she said. What? The spring. 3rd cushion, left side. Sorry, should have said something. He didn't respond. She carried the crackers and peanut butter to the coffee table and sat back down in the chair. She spread peanut butter on a cracker and ate it without ceremony because she was hungry and she'd stopped performing dignity for an audience about 4 years ago. He watched her eat with an expression she couldn't entirely read. When did you last have a real meal? He said. Define real. Something warm. Something that wasn't from a can. She thought about it. Tuesday. She'd had a bowl of ramen at the place near the bus stop, the one with the flickering sign and the best broth she'd ever tasted, and she'd sat there for 45 minutes longer than she needed to because it was warm and no one was asking her to do anything. "Recently enough," she said. He reached across the table and took a cracker. She stared at him. He spread peanut butter on it without breaking eye contact and ate it in 2 bites. "Okay," he said. "Tell me about the list," she told him. She told him about the previous job. Not the one before this one, the one before that, 3 cities ago, where she'd found a similar pattern in the accounts of a mid-sized freight company and made the mistake of reporting it through the proper channels. The proper channels had, it turned out, been owned by the same people running the scheme. She'd been out within a week. Blacklisted within a month. She'd spent 8 months doing data entry for a temp agency before she'd landed this contract, and she'd landed it because she'd applied under her middle name and a slightly different version of her professional history. She was not running, she was not hiding. She was surviving with the tools she had, and one of those tools was the ability to make herself look smaller than she was. Harlow listened. He didn't interrupt. This was, she noted, unusual for men of his type, the ones who had been listened to so long they'd forgotten listening was a skill. "And in this job," he said when she finished, "who have you made uncomfortable?" "Everyone," she said. "That's what auditors do, specifically." She picked up another cracker. "Your logistics director doesn't like me. He's been rerouting delivery records in a way that only makes sense if you're trying to make volume look lower than it is, and I pointed that out in my preliminary report. Not the full discrepancy report. A memo 3 weeks before." "I didn't see that memo." "I know," she said. "It never reached you." The room went very quiet. She'd known this, actually, for weeks. She'd tracked the routing of the memo through the internal system, not because she'd been paranoid, but because she'd tracked everything. It was automatic, the way breathing was automatic. The memo had been received by his assistant's office and marked read, but there was no record of it in any of the briefing documents prepared for Harlow for the following 2 weeks, which she'd accessed as part of her contract scope. Someone had sat on it. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been doing my job," she said, "without telling me. I tried telling you. The message didn't get through." She met his eyes, so I kept the documentation and waited. Waited for what? For whoever was watching me to show their hand. She looked at the folder, and tonight they did. He stared at her. She'd been operating in the margins of this organization for 6 weeks, building a picture, and what the picture showed was not one person with sticky fingers, but a coordinated effort with at least 3 moving parts, 2 of which were inside his operation, and 1 of which she was still trying to locate. She hadn't had enough to go to anyone. She'd needed 1 more piece. Now someone had handed it to her. Not to her, she corrected herself. To him. Someone had handed it to him, pointed at her, and assumed he'd deal with her the way men like him usually dealt with problems. They hadn't counted on him showing up at her door at 11:14 instead of sending someone else. She wasn't sure what to make of that. "You should have come to me," he said. "I didn't know if I could trust you." That landed harder than she intended. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the slight shift in his shoulders, the micro-adjustment of a man absorbing something he didn't like and choosing not to react to it. That took control. She gave him credit for it. "And now?" he said. She looked at him, the suit, the scar, the untucked collar, the tiredness around his eyes that no amount of expensive fabric could completely conceal. She thought about the fact that he was sitting in her apartment at nearly midnight, eating crackers, listening to her, not sending someone, not making a call. "Here, I'm still deciding," she said. He stood up. She braced herself, not physically but inwardly, in the way she'd learned to, the way you brace against a wave when you can't get out of the water. He walked to the window. He looked at the piece of cardboard stuffed into the gap. He didn't say anything about it, which was, she thought, either good manners or the specific tact of someone who'd grown up around a different kind of poverty than the kind she was living in. "There's a board meeting on Thursday," he said. "The quarterly review. I know. Can you be ready?" She thought about the folders she had at home, The backup copies she'd stored in 3 separate locations. The timeline she'd built over 6 weeks of 8-hour days and 18-hour days, and one night she'd slept on the floor of her office because she'd missed the last bus and couldn't afford the cab. "I've been ready," she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her cardigan, her sewing needle still on the counter, her soup can, her ledgers. "You live like you're expecting to leave," he said. She didn't answer. "Everything minimal, nothing on the walls, one good skirt." He looked at the skirt she'd been hemming, folded over the back of the chair. "You've left before. Twice," she said. "The third time you leave, you stop putting things on the walls." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to let them do this to you," he said. The words were so simple and so specific that she didn't know what to do with them. She'd been waiting for a threat, for a negotiation, for the particular brand of quid pro quo that men in his position usually deployed when they needed something from someone who had nothing. This wasn't that. This was something else, and she didn't have a category for it. "Why?" she said. "Because you didn't have to tell me," he said. "You could have found another way, sold it to someone else, used it differently." He looked at her. "You chose not to. That means something. It means I made a professional decision. It means you're one of about 3 people I've met in 15 years who did the right thing because it was the right thing," he said, "and that is worth something to me." She looked at her hands. The thin line of blood had dried on her thumb. "This isn't going to be easy," she said. "They'll push back. They'll come after me harder. Yes, and you can't protect me from all of it." "No," he said, "but I can make it a lot more expensive for them to try." She looked up. He was watching her with that same careful attention. The ledger check look, except that it felt now like something different, like he was adding up a column and the total was surprising him. "I need somewhere safe to work," she said. "My copies are in 3 locations. I need access to the internal servers, the real ones, not the versions they let contractors see. And I need 24 hours before Thursday. You'll have it. And when this is over," she said, "I want a letter, a real one, signed, that says I completed this contract in good standing. You'll have that too." She stood up. She was a full head shorter than him, which she was aware of the way she was always aware of physics in rooms with men like Harlow. She'd learned not to try to compensate for it. Instead, she looked up at him steadily and said, "Then we have a deal." He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go exactly when he should have, which told her something about the kind of man he was in the ways that mattered. He turned toward the door. "Harlow," she said. He stopped. "The logistics director. His assistant signs off on all the rerouted records, but the assistant didn't design the system. Someone with more access did, someone closer to the top." She looked at him. "I think you already know who." A long pause. "Yes," he said. "Then you know why you couldn't hand this to anyone inside." Another pause, smaller this time. "Yes," he said again. She nodded. "Good night." He left. She stood in the middle of her living room for a moment after the door closed, listening to his footsteps down the hall, steady and even, a man who moved through the world like he'd decided a long time ago that hesitation was a luxury he couldn't afford either. She and Harlow, she thought, had more in common than either of them would probably be comfortable admitting. She picked up the needle from the counter. She sat back down in the chair. She began to sew. The skirt was navy blue, thin at the hem from 3 years of wear. She'd bought it from a thrift store in a city she didn't live in anymore. The week after she'd been let go from the freight company, when she'd had $47 in her account, and the certain knowledge that she needed to look like someone who had more than $47 in her account. It had been a good investment. She'd worn it to every job interview since. She'd wear it on Thursday. She finished the hem at midnight and bit the thread with her teeth. Outside, the city kept doing what cities do. Someone's music, a bus, a door slamming 3 floors down, the sound of it muffled and ordinary, the sound of everyone else's lives proceeding as scheduled. She folded the skirt carefully and draped it over the back of the chair. She looked at the ledgers on the table. 22 days of work, 6 weeks of watching, 1 folder on someone's desk, and the wrong name written in the margin. She thought about what Harlow had said. that it meant something. She wasn't sure yet what it meant to her, but she picked up the folder and opened it again, and she sat at the table among her ledgers, and she worked until the sky outside the window started to change color, and by the time the early gray light came through the gap in the cardboard, she had everything she needed for Thursday, and a few things besides. She did not put her name in the margin. She put the truth there instead, laid out in the clean, unforgiving language of numbers, and let it speak for itself. That was, she had always believed, the only language that didn't lie.